Poor people who have dated rich people, what did you learn? Story 1. They don't really have a concept of how rich they are. My ex-boyfriend was wealthy, but had a complex about how he was super poor. It was because all of his friends were also so wealthy, and he was maybe marginally less rich than some of them, so he considered himself on the lower end of the scale. They don't really have a point of reference for how poor some people are. When we were together, I was living on a food budget of $50 a month, and he absolutely could not wrap his head around how a person could spend that little. I also lived with a horrendously rich friend. His family are aristocracy in his home country. One thing I've noticed about him is that he's completely incapable of grasping that if I stop working, I just stop being able to eat. He was confused about why I was worried about taking a week off work and didn't understand I was worried I'd lose money. He seemed to think that most people work because they choose to because he's never had to work. In my experience, upper middle and lower upper class folks complain the most about how little money they have. It's weird. If someone is in a position where all of their friends make more money than them, even if they themselves are in the top 10% or higher, it doesn't matter. They'll still think of themselves as poor. Story 2. Dated a girl for 3 years who came from old money. She was fine, but her family was beyond out of touch with the real world. They were nice people, but incredibly removed from the rest of the world. They looked at me like I was zoo animal in the sense that they were so curious about my life and my family. They'd ask me what it was like going to public school or how my parents immigrated. They were baffled that not everyone had vacation homes or traveled a lot. The most interesting thing is that old money is much more powerful than new money. They belonged to these clubs that consists of other rich families, and the influence they had was mind-blowing. Want to build a factory in an area not zoned for it? Within a week that was changed. Well, I believe classism even exists between rich people. I mean, even having rich friends makes a difference, giving you access to that special network. Story 3. I'm a guy who has dated women considerably wealthier than myself. My experience is that money becomes a factor sooner or later, no matter how closely you've connected on every other level. Even when the lady in question seems cool with it, there can be arch looks and withering comments from friends and family in social settings about what you've just ordered for dinner or what your holiday plans are. In those relationships, I've ended up being made to feel like a bottleneck. I'm either the person who the woman spends money on more than vice versa, or the person whose income puts more restraint on evenly shared expenditure than would otherwise be the case. In either scenario, there's pressure. And even if the woman seems fine with it, there are people around her who no doubt would claim they're just looking out for her, who will cheerfully flag every instance where the difference in income is apparent. Money doesn't have to warp people, but it seems it often does, whether it's actually their own money or not. That was such a good example of how the relationships between poor and rich usually don't work. Story 4. My ex-wife had a grandfather that was a multimillionaire. Christmas time at their house was like being in another world. All of the different family members would try to get a moment with the king and kiss as much as possible. I spent my time down on the ground playing with my kids and was happy to get out of there. About a week or two after the second Christmas, I got a phone call from Grandpa. He wanted to know what he could do for my family. I told him I didn't want any of his money, but I would like my kids to know their great-grandfather. Later that year, he showed up at our place unexpected and spent most of the afternoon telling stories with me about his youth. He set up a trust fund for each one of my kids to have their college paid for a little bit after that. He told me out of all of his in-laws, I was the only one that never asked him for anything but to be himself. I honestly think that's probably the one big complication with having money. You never really know who likes you for who you are and who just wants money. Story 5. I grew up poor. At the age of 18, I dated a super rich guy. First thing I noticed was the food. Not just quantities, but I also discovered so much food like oyster, fresh fish, olives, and much more. Things my parents could never buy. I also had to learn how to behave. My parents brought me up good. I read books all the time. I was a decent student and well-behaved kid. But the way his family interacted was so different. I had to learn a lot of unwritten rules that I wasn't aware of. I think in the end, what I actually learned was that even though my childhood was rough, and the amount of stress of not having enough money has probably impacted me for life, I valued my parents so much more. Once I had seen what life was like for rich people, I was just so proud of my family for making it work with so much less. I really loved how she changed her perspective of money in the end, and that she learned how being wealthy does not always mean being happy. Story 6. I went out with a girl briefly years ago, and her parents had a good amount of money. I grew up in a small cottage where we shared rooms and my parents slept in our living room. This girl's place. They had a private sauna, and her brother was given a curved smart TV. Must have been like a 50-inch, multiple new gaming systems. All tuition paid for university, etc. And here I am buying that and having my student loans all to myself. I think what I learned is people take it for granted sometimes what they have, while others value the basics. That is so true. Being poor makes you see the world how it really is. Story 7. I dated a girl from old money, generational inherited wealth. Grandpa's money, some corporate bigwig banker or something to that effect. I don't think her father ever worked a day in his life, and her mother clearly came from money as well. Outside of her, I found every one of her family members out of touch and completely unrelatable. I got real good at biting my tongue when my ex's siblings would complain about not getting a new car for their birthday when last year's model is sitting in the driveway. They had no concept of the value of money and never had to do anything for themselves to get what they wanted. I wasn't exactly poor growing up, but for the most part, if it wasn't strictly necessary for survival, I didn't have it. It was really eye-opening how everything was taken for granted. Those specific people would be helpless in the real world if they lost all their money. This is another story that proves that having money all the time makes people take everything as granted. Story 8. Mine's a bit on the positive side, I guess. I grew up dirt poor and I guess got to a point where I couldn't dream big. My family is still poor. I dated a guy who not only was a trust fund baby, but he also had a job as chief engineer and was making over $250K a year from that job. He didn't need the money. I was making $70K a year. He'd organize spontaneous holidays overseas and fun weekend activities that cost money. Told me to leave my card at home. Then in the short time we dated, he coached me into how to get a better paying job. Helped me learn and understand my worth and the value of my education and experience. While dating him, I quit my $70K job and landed a $100K one, then broke into the $200K a few years later. Now I have money and can take my parents and siblings on holiday as well as put my siblings through university and help them out. Well, I think chief engineers, no matter their origins, aren't stupid. Most certainly he earned his job and of course passed on his financial understandings to her. This is of course opposed to most of these other stories where the silver spoons have no brain. Story 9. My ex-boyfriend, let's call him Mike, comes from a family worth $12 million. He spent a lot of time in an elite boarding school in Canada, to the point of having a Canadian accent despite being ethnically Spanish and Austrian. His parents moved around a lot for work. They had houses in Austria and Spain and traveled a lot, to the point where there were a lot of times he genuinely didn't know where they were at any given time. When we were dating, he was a student in Edinburgh, and rather than renting a place, his parents had bought him an apartment in the city so they could rent out the spare rooms during the holidays. Occasionally, they'd even rent out his room, and he'd spend a few days sleeping at a friend's place or on the living room floor. After about 6 months of dating, he invited me to move in with him and said he'd arranged it with his parents that I could stay rent-free, with the rationale that I was going to be in his room and working, so I wouldn't be using up anything extra, taking up any more space, and I'd be paying for my own food. I cooked for the both of us, and if I didn't, I'd literally just microwave something quick for myself. For example, if I was working late and he'd already eaten. This was always supposed to be temporary, and I was going to find something with more space for myself because of the space situation. Unfortunately, it took me a few weeks to find a job. The only thing I could get that quick was part-time, and by the time I got a proper paycheck, it was like 6 weeks later, and I'd already eaten into a lot of my savings. His mother decided to come visit on 24 hours notice, and of course he starts freaking out. I stayed up until like 2 in the morning, despite having a 9 in the morning shift the next day, cleaning, and he said, "I'll clean tomorrow." He comes to meet me at the bus stop on my way home, and I find out that he hasn't cleaned because he knows it's impossible to meet her standards. And he hadn't told her that I was there because he knew she wouldn't approve it. This was supposed to be my first proper meeting with this woman because I'd previously met her once for 5 minutes when I came to meet him for our first date since she happened to be there. And this one was maybe 2 hours after she learned I'd been living there without her consent, and she immediately hated me. And I don't mean she hated me like I hate mushrooms. No, I mean she really hated me. The woman accused me of lying to her and taking advantage of her generosity. She gave me 2 weeks to find a place which I luckily managed. It was twice the price of an average room in the city. But since there was no security deposit, it was all I could afford with the money I had on hand. She banned me from the apartment. Then this 70-year-old woman spent 5 straight months sleeping on his couch or in his bed to make sure I respected the ban, and banned him from staying at my place despite the fact that I lived 5 minutes away. $140 worth of shoes and tickets for a gig in Manchester. I left at his place, apparently got stolen by people who stayed there. She eventually met me for coffee, spent a solid 2 hours telling me how toxic and vile I am while reiterating that she's not a monster. Then made me sign a contract agreeing to pay her $300 for the time I lived there without her consent. She knew that Mike lied. She didn't care because I believed the lies, and to her that was worse. He defended me as best as he could, but he still co-signed the contract. We lasted a few weeks after that. During this time, I didn't see him at all, despite having a total mental breakdown and relapsing into self-harm. I ended up dumping him, and when he turned up, he tried to act like everything was normal, like I'd seen him the day before. I ended up coaching him through the panic attack, almost immediately after we broke up. She moved on to Spain, still making sure that I wasn't stepping foot in the apartment. A few weeks later, his grandfather died, and he was banned from the funeral because of his exam. I was there for him because she expected him to just grieve on his own. I want to make it clear I didn't take advantage of his money. I know it's easy to say that, but I bought my own food, paid for my own transport, and I paid either half or everything for all of our dates. I genuinely believed that his mother was letting me stay there out of magnanimity. This whole thing ended up being over $300, a debt I didn't willingly incur and wouldn't have, to be honest. The stuff that got stolen by guests was worth over half of that. I mean, who wants to steal 2 pairs of Converse and a ticket to a gig in a different country? 6 months later, from a house that people actively live in. He told her she didn't care about the money, but it was all an intimidation tactic. She just wanted us apart. The thing that drove me apart is the fact that for all his defending me, he gave in when it mattered. He sat there across the table and he signed the contract. I did it because I thought it was my last chance to salvage our relationship. He did it because his mother told him to. The big thing I learned is that cruelty is universal, not just cruelty in the sense that Karen's gonna Karen. It didn't matter that Mike vouched for me. It didn't matter that at the time I thought I made him happy. It didn't matter that she imposed impossible standards on him or that I was there for him when she wasn't. I was there for him when he was totally catatonic. I was poor, and that means I was the problem. If I had money, maybe she would have accepted me. If nothing else, I wouldn't have felt the need to move into a shoebox 400 miles from home where I didn't even have wardrobe space. As it is, I was just a poor guy looking for a payout. He learned from me with his next boyfriend, and last I heard they had dated for 2 years and he hadn't met her. But it sucks that I gave so much to him and I was just someone to learn from. Now, I'm a lot more hesitant when it comes to relationships. I've only had one serious boyfriend since him, and we were dating for a solid 2 months before we decided to make it official. And the thought of meeting a boyfriend's parents outright gives me panic attack. To be fair, his ex's mom was a special level of psycho, and his ex is a special level of idiocy. Most parents a person meet could literally not be this bad. I'm sorry that happened to him. In future, he can always say no and walk out. Also, he didn't have to sit for 2 hours and listen to her.